I have done a pretty bad job of keeping time, so I think instead of having me ask our panelists more questions, I think I will ask them if they can join me up on the stage, and I think we'll just immediately go towards taking some of your questions as well as people who might have written in questions to our Twitter feed. And I think we will ask that, since there are some people who are outside of IFPRI, if you can introduce yourself when you first make the comment or question, and we'll take, depending on the number of questions, we'll take multiple questions and then let the panelists respond. Over here.
Hi, thanks. My name is Julie Howard. I'm an independent consultant, but I had a stint at USAID with the Bureau for Food Security for about 3 years. And before then, I worked in various capacities with Michigan State University, sort of looking at agricultural policy analysis. So I feel like I've been on both sides of the table here. And my question, I just found this, all the discussions by you very, very fascinating, sort of this integration of political economy and technical analysis. I wonder if you could give me your thoughts on the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which seems to me, Laura, I was really struck by your comments of the declining influence of aid, as other things are coming on board. So I think, what the new Alliance had really tried to do through the country cooperation frameworks was put on the table something that we know to be very important for countries, the prospective private sector investment, if priority policy areas can be addressed. And then going beyond just the political commitment, really laying out a framework and very specific timeline. So how does that whole process, I mean, miracles don't happen overnight, but how does that fit with your political economy framework? And what do you think of that as a model? And I'm not expecting this to be all rosy, but really would like your candid views on this.
Yeah, I have a question here. Sorry, we have a question right here. Sorry.
I'm Mike Jobbins with Search for Common Ground. We're a conflict resolution organization, and we've been part of a coalition advocating for improved political economy and conflict analysis in the humanitarian space. And two of the questions that came up from the presentations, which were very helpful, is one, how do you make political economy operational? That's something that we're grasping with. So it's not every 3 years or every 5 years, but it's informing the implementation of food security programs and other programs in a changing context on the ground. And the second is really not necessarily how, is really focused on the operational level and how programs can flexibly respond then. So not just the analysis is there, but I think one of the gaps that we often see with aid and other funded programs is how you make sure that you're shifting the implementation in a way that can then respond to changes. And so while the analytical capacity is there, often we find that the response capacity is not necessarily there.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Thank you for your presentations. I found them very useful. I'm Elena Shishkova. I'm with Global Development Network. And I was interested because when you're talking about local context, we work a lot with local researchers. We work on local research to inform development policies and issues. And I'm wondering how much you've engaged with local researchers for specifically the World Bank and USAID. You mentioned your own, for example, DG officers, but do you work with the local researchers who are more familiar with local context over the long haul?
Okay, maybe we'll give the panelists a chance to respond. So three key questions. One on the linkages with kind of new alliance commitments and how the model fits in. How do you make political economy analysis operational? I think that's one of the big elephants in the room. And how have you, particularly Verena and Laura, engaged with local researchers? Laura, do you want to first talk about the new alliance?
Yeah, sure. Julie, to respond to your question, I think this is a really great point, and I think, frankly, a tool that I feel that our colleagues in the Bureau of Food Security have, somewhat uniquely to draw on in terms of the tremendous work that the new alliance has done to really build a multinational framework for mutual accountability around these issues. I think the only thing I would add to it is also the importance of, these are some discussions that I've had with colleagues in BFS over the past few years, is that, as we shift as an agency more to the extremely poor, what are we going to be able to do to, kind of ensure that the work that we're doing at the national level to deliver on these commitments is really inclusive of the most marginalized groups. And that's, I think, and that's the point that I was trying to make, is that's where I think the power disparities and the need for really an understanding of the disparities in voice and accountability really comes to play. And how can we be thinking as an agency more concertedly about how we bring various stakeholders to the table, recognizing that this is an incredibly difficult situation in some of the places that we're looking to target in sub-Saharan Africa. I wanted to respond to your question, especially around use of local researchers. I'd be interested to hear from Fren on this as well, but this is something that's critically important to any of it. And I think with the PEAs that I've been engaged in, and also the DRG assessments that I've been engaged in over the past 10 years or so, this is probably the most critical point. We can bring in, and one of the things that we've been talking about a lot as we think about our framework is, you can bring in folks with a background in political economy analysis, both from within USAID or from the contractor community, but that has to be married up, as Verena said, not just with folks with an understanding of the technical context, but also the local context. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot recently, as you think around the political sensitivities surrounding political economy analysis, is, as part of your conduct of this analysis, is there a way to kind of look at capacity development for local actors engaged in this sort of work? DRG officers in missions often have very good relationship with think tanks, with advocacy organizations, many of whom already have a great understanding of this. Can we be thinking about, either leveraging that capacity, or thinking about, through our programming, are there ways of developing that capacity? So it's not necessarily USAID that has that understanding of the context and the ability to leverage that in terms of more successfully and strategically supporting policy reform, but that expertise resides in country among the organizations that you would expect to be playing a huge role in that. And then finally, in terms of the operationalization of it, this is a great question, and something that we've struggled with, I think, a bit, because drawing on the experience of our colleagues in DFID as well, in terms of how do you develop an analysis that is, long enough to really serve a knowledge management function, but also short enough that there is, first of all, the energy to be able to revisit this at 6 months or 1 year intervals, or 3 month intervals in some of the more challenging contexts in which we work. But what do you need to really leave with a mission or an office in terms of what are the triggers that you would want to take a look at? To the extent that there is, a change in, change in the ministry, change within the ministry, a change in context that would really trigger you to take another look at that analysis. So how can you embed an analysis that is, laying out the realities of the system that you're looking to examine, but also leaving the mission with a sense of, what are the things that you would want to use as prompts to really think about getting back into the field and refreshing that analysis. And then finally, how do we develop programming that really does have that flexibility to it, and thinking about some of the work that our colleagues in ODI have done in terms of looking at issues of arm's length aid, and thinking about how you'd build those relationships with local actors, and leaving enough space in terms of the higher level objectives that you would want to be achieving through programming, but leaving enough space for maneuver in terms of the tactics that would you be using to get to policy outcomes, to enable local actors to really engage more broadly with the system, but also have the ability to chase down opportunities as they present themselves, because that's entirely unpredictable in most of the places that we work.
Colin,
Okay.
do you want to respond?
I'll take a couple of them. Julie, on the new alliance, I have to say I'm more cautious about the new alliance, and I recognise it's multifaceted, and there's an attempt to get movement on particular policy priorities in countries, and there's a desire to stimulate private investment in these countries, and I think particularly in the downstream aspects of those value chains, that's really important. Where I am more cautious is where it appears that there are the prospect of quite large quantities of land and water rights going to large-scale investors in those countries. And I think I've asked myself, I don't really have an answer to this question, but do we really know what the motivation of the senior politicians in the countries who are signing these compacts is? And in one or two cases, I suspect that there's a certain frustration with their ability to deliver agricultural growth given their existing state systems, which are non-functional, which comes back to the point that Verena was mentioning before, and that the private sector could offer a shortcut to growth. And whilst there's some benefits in doing that if you cannot move quickly with your state system, my concern particularly around the area of land is we know that land rights are not well respected in quite a lot of these countries. They're not well codified. There are all sorts of uses of land that in law are not very well recognized, and actually the very lack of state capacity to really ensure that all of these due diligence is done on these land allocations gives me quite a bit of concern that we might end up disadvantaging as many or more people than are advantaged. And the other side of that coin is that there's a narrative around smallholder inclusion in these value chains, which I think is really important. But in what I've seen, I haven't seen the sort of concrete steps or the specified in the compacts as to whose responsibility it is to ensure that that happens, who's going to do what are the things to ensure this is going to happen. And one of the critical things I would think is actually how much land is given out. And if you give out a huge parcel of land, as we sometimes see on offer, then an investor can come in and why do you need to engage with smallholders who are surrounding that parcel of land, because you will satisfy your processing requirements for your own estate. And I would have thought that actually some sort of guidelines around the land allocation within this would be really important in terms of defining the incentives as to whether the investors will or will not engage with smallholders surrounding them. And I think that is missing at the moment. Can I say something very quickly just about the local researchers? Obviously, we have tried to engage with African researchers, and my main comment would be I found some great people to work with. At the start of the program, none of them knew each other. They were all lone individuals. They were political scientists with an interest in the agricultural sector. There were no networks connecting them together. And there is really a need for building that sort of thing so that they can learn from each other.
Verena, do you want to add anything about incorporating local researchers or operationalizing these frameworks?
Yeah, thank you. I thought on the operationalization, when we looked at the book that Danielle showed at the beginning of the session, what we found when looking across sort of 8 examples of relatively well done political economy analysis, that you find some commonalities also in the types of implications that result from them. So it includes asking, is there something that we can do differently? Is there additional stakeholders that we engage with and that we can try to convince? So occasionally we go further out of our way and give some, try to hold more stakeholder discussions, including some, public statements, to try and explain why we think certain policies will have a better payoff. Because often you have also some misconception about the effects that certain policy choices have. And discussing that just with technical experts in the ministry may have some impact, but if sometimes governments are welcoming this because they also like to sort of use us to convince reluctant populations of certain things. And so sometimes that offers opportunities to engage with a wider set of stakeholders in favor of certain policies. And there's a couple of examples. And very occasionally it will tell us not to do something. The question is how to react to very fluidly evolving situations. So I'm currently working on South Sudan, and it's a supremely fluid place, not only in terms of what the government is doing, the peace negotiations, but also as what the programming then is of other development partners and what we should be doing, so as not to duplicate and to mesh well. And I think, of course, a good way is if you can embed some analytical capacity within your team. It depends a little bit sometimes how much money you have to allocate to this issue of a very much evolving context. Also in our Somalia team, for example, we have a team member who really for each project, dips into a network of contacts and says, well, is this actually feasible? And we do that in part because visits on the ground are so constrained. But it's really a unique setup in a sense for that team. So there are ways of doing it, but of course, I think as others have already said, there is always some constraints coming from our business model. So we do set certain projects in place, and within them we have a degree of flexibility. Or if you work for a donor agency, you make certain promises of what you will deliver. And I think, there's a wider discourse that's been sort of going on and off in waves of how to make external assistance more flexible and more adaptive. And I think the political economy recognition would also feed into that and would support that, but it's also a wider discussion. Just very briefly on the work with local researchers, I think there is a slightly, but still, not a huge pool of local people who you can work with. As Colin was saying earlier, there's far more technical agricultural specialists in Sudan than people who would be interested or willing to do much about the political economy side. Now, what we can do, that's perhaps a bit more of a difficult country environment context. Now, you can, of course, make sure that you spend quite a bit of time dipping into these sources and then protecting them and getting some of the information that way. And then many other contexts, it gradually is building up that we have those kinds of networks. What we, on the other hand, shouldn't, and I think we shouldn't sort of therefore say we don't need international agency or consultant staff anymore, because the comparative perspective, is this a big problem? How has this been addressed in other countries? That is also very valuable. So we really need a good combination of both.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's take a next round of questions. We'll start with Schengen.
Well, thank you. Thank you for organizing this panel. We have been struggling this research topic for the last probably 10 years when we begin to set up the governance research team, where we're still struggling, but this is another step to accelerate that progress. Two questions. One is at a global level. In 2007, 2008, we experienced the food price crisis. So we have seen accelerated donor support and agriculture investment in agriculture. But today I see that sort of initial excitement has come down. So what's going on here? What is the political economy happening at the donor agencies? Should we have another crisis before the donors begin to invest again? That's one. Second, you were talking about political feasibility for changing certain policies. Can we also do experiments to push the frontier, to really increase the political feasibility? One example is with the subsidies you have all mentioned, Colin particularly, when we worked on the Indian case, right, some years ago, 10 years ago, we found that there were subsidies, particularly subsidies in fertilizers, in water, in electricity, actually do not need much efficiency gain. Farmers even don't benefit. But when I talked to the Indian politicians, they said, look, I know all this. I couldn't wait to cut the subsidies, but the farmers don't like it. But if we can do some experiments to show the farmers, actually we have a better alternative to support you. It's direct income support. But in the meantime, you pay for your electricity, full price of fertilizers, water. So I give you income. Then you optimize your input use. Show them, work with farmers, work with the local researchers to demonstrate, hey, you have an alternative way in supporting you. So can we do the research, evidence Colin also mentioned, to bring the new evidence to really push the political feasibility for some positive changes.
Thank you. Yes. Pass the microphone on.
James Sang, following up on the last question on experiments, has anybody done the experiment of taking a particular analytic tool and asking a number of different analysts to use it and seeing how large a variation in output you get? My impression is political scientists quite often find it very easy to disagree on almost everything.
Thank you. Yes.
Tom Timberg, independent consultant. I'm a little bit disturbed about Dr. Colton's discussion of what's happening in terms of land tenure, since it's not consistent with a major study that has just come out on what is actually happening with African land tenure, which is that the large-scale farms are not expanding, presumably because of their own weight. What is expanding is medium-sized farms at the expense of the poor, in a couple of cases being bought up by urban civil servants and people with urban sources of income, taking over the land. If that's the case, it suggests that, sort of following up on the previous discussion, maybe we don't know very much about what is happening in the political economies of the countries concerned. It's particularly an item of concern because the people doing the analysis are typically, naturally enough, centered in the cities, in contact with a relatively narrow section of the people. So if the statistics aren't accurate, and if the people they talk to are unrepresentative, the question is, what grasp of the underlying reality do they have to apply, however good their analytical tools are?
Okay, Katrina?
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. I was really found it very interesting hearing Verena's comments, first of all, about the fact that we can't just look at the stakeholders supporting a policy versus against a policy. There's lots of other structural and institutional factors we need to take into account. And Laura definitely echoed this as well when she was talking about the fact that it's not always the case that we have the people that support a policy and the people that oppose a policy. There's a lot of people that don't know the impact of a policy, and they may oppose it because they simply do not understand what the impact would be. And I feel like myself, this is very understudied, so it was interesting to hear this drawn out and echoed. I was wondering if this panel, any and all of you, could sort of give your insights into what do we do about the uncertainty of policy impact. Does it potentially undermine our ability to do political economy analysis, and how do we think through it, or potentially link up with people doing the impact analysis in order to make sure that they're asking questions on the same issues, so the synergies between the two works can lead to some good understanding and policy prescriptions.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move over to this side. We have a question here.
Hello, my name is Sudhir Vanmali. I work for ICF International. Two questions. If decentralization is underway in sub-Saharan Africa, I would like to know how far it has succeeded in decentralizing truly. The Indian example, for example, from 1956 was they decentralized administration, finance, as well as planning activities to the district level and below. And today, 70 years on, or close to 70 years on, you have standing committees on every other sector of the economy, which are not necessarily line ministry outposts in the sub-district areas, tehsil areas, but they are actually independent functioning units. So you have standing committees on transport, on irrigation, on marketing, on health, on education, which are all functioning in the context of 5-year elections that are held every 5 years in the Indian rural countryside. Ghana and Kenya that I know of, Kenya, of course, recently, 47 counties have been decentralized. They are all clamoring for strengthening their capacities in order to do administration, finance, and planning, in order to know what they need to do in order to deliver the goods and services that we were talking about. There are huge gaps in capacities at the district level or county level, in district assembly level in Ghana, county level in Kenya. And even if there is a line ministry extension, agricultural extension worker, he is looking at crops which are not managed by women. He is looking at livestock which are not looked after by women. And there are women's crops and women's livestock in these countries which are specific. So if those line ministry things are not operating, and if you do not have full representation of all the line ministries at the district assembly or at the county level, what time limit are we putting to make sure that these developments will take place, will take root, and will actually be beneficial to the population?
Okay. Thank you. I think we need to move on to another question.
Dr. Poulton said 10 years. I would argue 20 years for it to work properly.
Okay, thank you. I think we just have time for one more question here in the audience.
Thank you, Brian Greenberg with Interaction. Wanted to appreciate the presentations and just offer something on operationalization first, which was, Laura, I was really struck by your equating political economy with a kind of grammar on which the rest of policy would build. I think that's really critical. And Colin was struck by your reflection on the difference, or your difference in worldview as an ag economist versus the political economist. And it strikes me that perhaps we are now inheriting some of the tendency, which comes and goes cyclically, to make too much of development policy as a technical domain detached from the political domains of policy, and so that we have people making policy analysis and recommendations without, or in a context too free of the political realities. I would hope that creating teams could bring that kind of cross-disciplinary view into the picture. But it seems to me that more we may need to treat this like we have treated other cross-cutting issues such as gender and environmental sustainability, where we push that out and expect people to be more cognizant and competent in those basic areas, whatever else they may be doing. And then very quickly, I wanted to see if you had any reactions to the ways that aid effectiveness discourse and country ownership may have affected the grounds for political economy analysis, because it seems there are a couple of potentially paradoxical influences. On the one hand, country ownership suggests that donors and outside development actors need to harmonize and synchronize themselves with country policy without attempting much in the way of, if you will, a critical intervention which attempts to reset some of the inequities or power disparities. And at the same time, it also offers a more normative framework around inclusive development, participation, engagement, which potentially brings and a more objective optic through which to view country policies, which may, I'm sorry to run, which may run counter to those main country policy currents. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we got a lot of food for thought. We are really kind of close to the end of time, so I would ask each of you to maybe pick the one or two questions or comments that you feel strongest about, and keep your comments relatively brief. I think we'll go reverse order this time and give Verena a chance to respond first, if she would like.
Now I have to quickly pick which one I think most about. So just with regards to this question of can we do experiments, I think experiments can be one way of convincing different stakeholders that something could work, right? Because it's very understandable that, would disadvantage if you want stakeholders initially distrust certain policies because they don't necessarily trust that if, a little bit of something is being taken away from them, they will be refunded or reimbursed in some other way. And so I think building that kind of trust and demonstrating that a good outcome can be beneficial both for the, if you want to say in the broad, for the farmers and also for the elite actors that have to do these policies. And we see that it's a very widespread challenge when we approach subsidy reforms. Another thing that we have done is to do surveys to even see to what extent people are aware of what is subsidized in their country. Because often people are not aware or think that subsidies are very small, while in fact they're a very large portion of the price, or vice versa. And again, that can help to influence the public dialogue. Let me, I think, just stop here for the sake of time.
Okay, thank you, Verena. Okay, Colin?
Yeah, I want to say something very quickly about the experiments, which I also think are promising, but there are cases where they may yet not get traction. And I think about one of the case studies in our development policy review special issue, which was Kenya in the 2000s, where there were at least 3 major donor-funded extension programs, each piloting a different way of doing extension in the country, which in China would have been the perfect thing, because you look at them all, you decide which one works, and you then say, right, we roll that out across the whole place. But because it was the whole issue of national public goods and the weak demand for that, nobody did that. The government didn't take advantage of that. They all sort of then finished, and that was the end of the program. So you do need still somebody who's ultimately interested in knowing, what really works here, and are we then going to take it on? And in that context, experiments are great, I think. I had a very direct question to me about land in Africa. My point was about what seemed to be the future trajectories of the new alliance rather than the current. There is a fantastic special issue of food policy on land in Africa, which Derek Heddy here and Tom Jane have edited, and I was the food policy editor who made sure that happened. I think it's one of the best special issues we have produced for a long time, with some great evidence of what's actually going on the ground. And yes, the fact of local elites taking plenty of land is one of the things that does come up in there, but there are also projections about large-scale land acquisition alongside that, which are quite worrying in some contexts. So, and then there was a quick thing on country ownership and donors harmonizing to what their countries decided rather than challenging it. My quick observation on that would be that in our 2 different types of countries, actually the strongest ownership over policy is in Rwanda and Ethiopia, and they have some pretty robust debates with the donors about what should be done. But policy is a serious business there, and actually I think those very robust debates where you do disagree and the country says no on some things, but then when it says yes, it's committed, is actually a much more healthy situation than notionally harmonizing, which basically means you make such a broad set of priorities that everybody gets theirs under that umbrella, but there's no real prioritization at all. So I don't think that that's actually a problem. I think the debate and the disagreement can be quite healthy there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right.
Colin's just raised a really interesting point specifically on Ethiopia and Rwanda, and kind of thinking about the issue of country ownership. I was out in Ethiopia a couple of years ago actually looking at some public financial management work that we were thinking about doing, and one of the interesting conversations we had was with the government and thinking about how the Wareda level, the neighborhood level planning was filtering back up to the national level. And there was a great deal of work being done at the local level, but when you looked at how it filtered back up and how the policies came back down, there was a massive disconnect. And I think one of the things that's really interesting around the country ownership debate is if you really think about Busan, right, and getting much more broad beyond governments as you think about really where country priorities are there opportunities for us as donors to think about, developing the sorts of programming that would be bringing a more whole of society approach to these sorts of issues in places like Ethiopia, where this is a very difficult discussion to have. I think, Brian, to just respond to another point that you raised about, kind of building that cross-fertilization and kind of thinking about how you would mainstream. It's interesting that you've raised the idea of environmental sustainability. One of the conversations that we've been having within USAID over the past year or so is the idea of, to the extent that there is a sustainability analysis that you should be carrying out as part of your programming, what you're looking at is the sustainability of results. To the extent that those results are really the product of local actors and local systems, that's really where the political economy analysis comes home to rest, and really thinking about how you can develop interventions that are, driven by rooted in local context, interventions that are very much focused on supporting local actors to take that change forward and sustain it. So there is, I think, an opportunity to kind of think about what this would look like in practice and mainstream an approach to this over the long term. I'm hopeful. And then finally, I wanted to respond to your question about the political economy of donors and, kind of the boom and bust cycles of development practice. I mean, I think one of the things that we see, and Collins raised this, is the importance of saying, to the extent that you really want to support policy and its implementation over the long term, this is a much longer term time horizon than we're used to dealing with in the development community. I think that's especially acute for us within the U.S. political context right now, where there's almost a pressure increasingly to be reporting quarterly on the results that you're raising. I think that there is a discussion that needs to happen both within USAID, but also more broadly, I think, in our appropriations environment, about the fact that and really building the evidence base for taking these longer term approaches to investing in local systems, investing in local actors, and taking the time that it's going to need to take to effectively implement these policies. I think on the one hand, there is an evidence base that needs to be brought for the impact of those sorts of approaches, but also there's a conversation that needs to happen around the importance of longer time horizons and not throwing billions of dollars at a problem and then walking away from it in 2 years' time.
Thanks very much, Larry. Well, I think I wanted to thank all three of our speakers this afternoon, and all of you for participating in the conversation. It's clear that even though these approaches have been around for quite a while, that we're still thinking through their applicability, especially to food security and agriculture, and I think still many more questions have been raised than we've been able to answer yet. But thank you again, and let's keep the conversation going.